afternoon. I'm really excited to be here today. It sounds like this is a really cool class, and even just looking at the syllabus and your list of guest speakers, it sounds like you've had some really amazing people come in and talk with you about different ways of approaching the media. And what I'm hoping that we can talk about together here today has specifically to do with disability and accessibility. And I guess just to give you a little bit of background in terms of the work I do and my own interest in disability studies. Primarily, I look at online communities, and so as was it Carol? Carol was just mentioning, most of my work has to do with the autism community. And there are a few reasons why I have these particular interests. So one is that I was diagnosed as a teenager as being on the autism spectrum. And so my initial interest in disability studies came from more of a personal advocacy perspective because I was really confronted with having to do that kind of advocacy work in my own life. But it wasn't really until I was in graduate school that I was at all interested in topics surrounding accessibility and disability in any kind of academic or scholarly way. And what I think is particularly interesting, especially about our current moment, is that over the past 15 years especially, there have been a number of disability communities that have really sprouted up online, and that's primarily where they do their activism for a number of reasons. I think that we could think about technology, especially digital technologies, almost as a pros and cons list when it comes to accessibility. And in that pros column, I think that the top thing that might be in there would have to do with geographical distance. So often when we talk about accessibility, it's usually focused on the physical terrain. And in a few minutes here, I'd actually like us to talk about the configuration of this room and how we might think about it from an accessibility studies perspective. But people with disabilities are often prevented because of physical barriers from going out to places. Right, so people with disabilities often have to rely on public transportation. If you're living in a rural area, it makes it very difficult to sort of traverse those kinds of landscapes. Additionally, often when you're diagnosed with a disability, you're the only person in your family who has that particular disability. And if you live in an area that isn't highly populated, it's very likely that you might be the only person in your entire school who has that particular disability. So I think for those particular reasons, online communities, especially Tumblr, blogging websites, live journal communities, Facebook communities have really taken off connecting people who wouldn't otherwise have contact with each other. So that's where my own interests have kind of entered in. And the reason that I find this so fascinating is because when we're thinking about disability and when we're thinking about design in a new media kind of sense, disability has the possibility to open up access for more than people who just identify as disabled. So the primary example that accessibility theorists really love to give has to do with curb cuts. Right? We can think about how sidewalks are designed initially, right, when we're talking about that little incline on sidewalks. Those are particularly designed for wheelchair users in mind, so that when you're outside, you can use a sidewalk and not have to roll your wheelchair out in the middle of the street and potentially get hit by a car. And unfortunately, not all sidewalks are designed in this way. But curb cuts are of also potential benefit to people who are pushing strollers, shopping carts, luggage, anything on wheels. It makes it easier in the winter, especially when there's treading, so that you're not falling and tripping and not noticing that a curb is there when there's a lot of snow around it. So we can think about how things like universal design and accessibility have really far-reaching implications. I want to come back to this image a little bit from now, but just so you know what it is, I actually took this photograph at Eastern Michigan University. Somebody had gone around and defaced all the wheelchair icons on campus and drew angry faces on them because it took a really long time to locate ramps on certain buildings. So if you ever go down to EMU, I think that some of the graffiti is still there. You'll notice that these angry faces are drawn on the placards that are furthest away from the ramps on the outside of the building. So really quickly, I thought it might be important for us to just talk about some basic models of disability and how they kind of play out both in academic conversations on disability, but also how activists tend to use them in the community. So I think the first model of disability, the one that we tend to be most familiar with, is a medical model of disability. This is kind of a model that tends to dominate when we're talking about how the public at large thinks of disability. And from a business perspective, from a hospital perspective, disability is typically viewed as something that needs fixing or curing. Right? So if you have a disability, this is a problem, we need to remediate it really quickly, we need to fix you up, we need to look at a cure, we need to find treatment. Turn on the TV, chances are you'll be greeted with some kind of advertisement that positions disability in this way. So if you see advertisements about diabetes, autism advertisements really take on this tone. They're all about cure and funneling off statistics about how many people are affected by X, Y, Z diagnosis. Part of the problem here with this model, though, and this is one of the reasons why disability activists writ large have really been working against this kind of framework of disability, is that it tends to position disabled people as somewhat less than human. And it fails to recognize disability as being a part of a person's identity. So this doesn't mean that in certain cases, certain contexts, and for certain people, that things like treatment aren't necessary or important. Right? It doesn't necessarily mean that the medical establishment is in its entirety a really hugely awful thing and that disabled people don't want to go to hospitals ever. But what it does mean is that people with disabilities have long been advocating for changing the systems and the way that they often represent disability. A social model of disability makes a distinction between disability and impairment. Has anybody ever heard of this particular distinction before? Just out of curiosity, in case we have some people who are activists in the room. Awesome, okay. So here's the basic distinction. If we're talking, for example, about blindness as a disability, so we'll give this as an example. Impairment usually refers to your lived bodily condition. So if you are blind, you have vision loss of some kind. This has to do very concretely, in a sense, with your eyes, with your body, right? So that would be impairment. When we're talking about disability, however, we're talking about something that is socially constructed, meaning that it's not that we are disabled by our impairments per se, but we're more disabled by society as a whole. So if we're talking about this room, for instance, and the very construction of it, way down on this side here, we've got a railing, and it looks like there's a railing on that side too, but is there any kind of ramp at the front of the room here to actually get up to the seats up front? No, right? And it looks like there's a door back there, and that might be an alternative entrance for somebody who might want to sit at the back there, but I don't know if it's a door or a closet. But essentially, the way this room is configured, right? If we assume that that door is a closet, if you are a person who uses a wheelchair or cannot go upstairs, you are confined to the front of the room at all times, and you become a visual display for the other people who are sitting in the back. So in that particular example, that's an example of the social model of disability. It's not the fact of being in a wheelchair that means you can't access the back row. It's the fact that the room isn't designed for you to access the back row. And if there were a ramp of some kind, or if this room were flatter, that wouldn't be an issue. I wanted to go over two more things that are really part and parcel with the social model of disability, but they're really more explicitly related to how we think about new media design when it comes to access. And there are two really dominant theories right now about design and how we think about disability that sort of function as the larger narrative in disability studies. And the first is universal design. And universal design basically means that you are trying to design things for the maximum number of users possible. So this isn't necessarily always disability specific, but it means that you are really, really, really trying to be universal in how you think about audience. So not just a specific group of people, but as many people as possible. And with universal design, the aim is to try and do this from the very beginning of when you're designing something. So if you're creating a website, from the very start, you want to make sure that you design that website in a way that describes all images, that has captions for any video or audio content. You want to ensure that you don't have any flashy things going on that might cause seizures for someone. It's really inherent in how you start the design. So this means that you don't create a website and then go back 2 years later and try to fix or retrofit it so that it'll work for people. Participatory design is very similar in some ways to universal design in that it's trying to be very inclusive, but there's a slight difference. Participatory design is a design process that involves the very people you're trying to design for. So if you were hoping to create a how-to manual about college life for students on the autism spectrum, you would have, as co-designers, students on the autism spectrum, right? So you're taking your specific target audience and they are becoming co-designers with you. And disability studies folks have really largely been moving more toward this kind of theory of design in the past 10 years. Because when we're talking about disability, disabled people are often excluded from the very conversations that concern them. And we can see this in a lot of different places. For instance, a lot of the major disability charities in the US don't have any people with that specific disability on their governing boards, right? So you could look at Autism Speaks as an organization, for example. They're the largest autism charity in the world, and there are no autistic people at all involved in the governance of their organization. There are a number of mental health organizations that have the same framework and setup. I think that this is a good moment to sort of take a break and to try and think about how these kinds of ways of thinking about design and access might play out in a very concrete way in this particular classroom. So I thought what might be a good exercise is with the people who are sort of sitting near you at your desk station to sort of stand up, walk around, and take a look at the design of this room and think about what kinds of bodies this room was designed for. So I gave an example a couple minutes ago about the stairs and the ramps, but I'd like you to try and think broader than that, and it doesn't even necessarily need to be disability specific. So you might pay attention to the physical landscape. You might pay attention to things like acoustics or how you're able to see from certain positions in the room. So this might require you to go to the back, come to the front, sit at different desks and be at different positions. You might even want to see if that back door opens and if it indeed does go to the closet or not. But think really, really capaciously and broadly. Who was this room designed for and who wasn't it designed for? And so maybe we can take about 10 minutes for people to wander around, and I'd really like you to be as detailed as possible and exhaustive. So move around, move things, look at stuff. And we'll come back and I'd love to hear from you. Going back to their seats. I'd love for us to get a conversation going, just in terms of the things that you observed. So why don't we perhaps start kind of in the back. We'll kind of move around the room and see some of the things that people notice. So would anybody like to share a couple of the items that they found?
I guess just one thing that I noticed is that it's really cramped back here. There's not a lot of space between tables, so if you had any sort of like mobility issue, not necessarily like your legs, but it would just be like kind of claustrophobic and cramped.
Yeah, so to repeat, so there isn't much, especially in the back, distance between rows. It's particularly cramped, so it makes it really hard to move in and out of the space. Yeah, so the height of the desks registers pretty starkly. And I didn't even realize there was a single in there. So that's kind of interesting too.
We talked about the windows in the back, how the windows let in a lot of light. So like if a room's really dark, it can kind of cause people not to pay as much attention because it's dark, but this really brightens up the room.
So this is, what we've just brought up is an issue that's usually called competing access needs. So right now, the window can serve to enhance access for some people, right? If we're thinking about lighting, like the fluorescent lights can be really hard on people's eyes. And it's just also kind of depressing, frankly, fluorescent lights. But natural lighting, if we were to pull up the windows, it might serve as a distractor for some people as well, right? So we're thinking about competing ways of paying attention. If the window's open, there's something cool outside, maybe someone's like playing with a really cute puppy or something, right? That's kind of a distractor from whatever's going on up here on the screen. So let's go here and we'll go to the next one.
The room is really wide, so when you're talking across your
Did people on the other side hear what she just said?
No.
So she said the room is really wide and it's hard to hear what people are saying on the other side. There aren't speakers in the back. If you look at the placement of the speakers in the room, notice where they primarily appear. The height and placement of the screens, right? The assumptions that are made about the people who are even speaking at the front of the room are particularly loaded. This is a pro, potential pro of the room, something that enhances access. So thinking about how your desks are shaped, right? So the fact that you are sitting right here, sort of sit with you, I can directly see you, you're in my line of sight, and it facilitates conversation at least in small groups. Maybe not wide scale, but small scale. So we're going to go to the back and we'll come around to the front.
You notice that there's kind of an assumption that you have technology in all of the plugs on everyone's desk. So it's like it just assumes that you should be able to afford and carry around technology.
So now we're getting into a very real issue of material access, right? So the assumption that everybody in here is going to be carrying a laptop of some kind. So I think that there are a lot of things built into that. There's assumptions about finances, right then and there. There's also assumptions about use and ability to use, right? And that's also built into whether or not somebody will bring in a laptop and what kind of laptop or other form of technology they might bring in. Arms on the chairs. Are there any chairs in here that don't have arms on them? Right there, we've got one. Is there any others? You could look at the chair you're sitting and just double check that it doesn't seem that way. So this is, you've got another one. All right, we've got 2 chairs in the room that do not have arms on them. So that's actually particularly depressing right then and there, and it's making a pretty profound statement about the kinds of bodies that are meant to sit in them. Yes?
There's one set of single wide and another set of double wide doors.
And would somebody mind demonstrating and going to that door over there, actually the double doors, and just opening for us to see? So we can have a visual demonstration. So taking a look about how wide that entryway is, right? It's not terribly wide. And how heavy is the door if you had to estimate? It's pretty heavy, right? It's a struggle just standing right there, so it's okay if you close it. The doors are heavy, and they're not terribly wide. So imagine trying to open that. Well, actually, you don't have to imagine because you do at least twice a week. Have to open the doors. It's not a terribly easy way of getting into the room. Yeah, so 2 items here. One has to do with the angle you're sitting at and whether or not you can see the screen or the board. Especially if you're in an edge row and you're in a kind of awkward position, you're only going to catch the side of it and not the whole frame. The other item that came up was kind of the claustrophobia of the room. So depending on how many people are enrolled in a given class, this is potentially very tight quarters. It looks like there are a couple of desk stations in the room that only have maybe 1 or 2 people, so you might be more comfortably situated or seated if you fall into that particular category. But coming down to the front and especially in the middle, these seem to be the popular areas of the room. Just judging by the distribution. It's a lot tighter quarters, right? We've got 5 people piled around this particular seat. In the corner here, we've got 4, and it looks like you've got all your stuff pulled out and there's not much elbow room. So we could keep going on and on, I think, listing things.
I'm actually curious what you guys discovered about that door. I'm wondering, does it even explore that?
Yeah.
It's a ramp that goes up to the door, but we noticed that if you were to bring a wheelchair there, you'd be stuck on that level. Like you couldn't go down because there are stairs. So I don't really know what the purpose of it is to have the ramp go up there.
Is there an entryway? Like, were you able to find the entrance? So it's back.
Just right next to this door. There's not even a door. It's just kind of like a pathway up a ramp and then to the door here.
And then you'd basically be stuck at the back the entire time. And we could even ask too, I mean, in terms of the setup of the desks, right? We could pay attention to the height of them, and depending at what level or height the wheelchair you might be using is, it might be very difficult to actually sit at the desk. also, if there weren't any markings that led to the ramp, I think it would be really difficult to know that that ramp existed or how to find it, right? Which also puts an added burden on somebody who might need that ramp. So typically when this kind of situation arrives, that's where the Office for Disability Services comes in. But having to do this, right? Things we take for granted in terms of moving around, getting around, having to go through extra steps to figure out whether or not there's even a doorway you can enter to get into the room in which you want to take a class is an endless kind of situation, and it's an added burden that other people generally don't have to deal with. The comment had to do with labeling and texture. So looking at all of the different switches on the walls, the light switches, the podium display, the signage, there's nothing in Braille. And so thinking about accessing the necessary features of the room, especially if you're a presenter or an instructor and you're trying to use the podium stuff up front. But I think we could also talk about even how sound carries in the room. Like as I'm talking here, I feel like my voice is going up, but not necessarily back. I don't know if that's an accurate perception for people who are in the back or not, but that's my own perception here. All right, so I'd like us to take this conversation a little bit further, right? We've talked about the room and how it's designed and some of the both positive accessibility features of the room, but also some of the really, really huge issues with how the room is constructed and how it might impede not only access and entry into the room, but somebody's learning within the room. And I'm gonna skip ahead. I have this PowerPoint with pretty images, but what I'd like us to do is to actually think about access in a different kind of context, something that's more mediated, and connects back to the readings that you did for today. And I thought it might be useful to actually take a look at the video you watched for today. There's just a short segment of it. And here's what I'm proposing we do. So I'm first going to show the first minute of the video you watched with the subtitles on. And I'd just like you to pay attention to the positioning of those subtitles. Right? Think about how they're timed with the video and how they're integrated with the video and how they connect back to the content of the narrative. And then I'm going to show you the uncaptioned, the unsubtitled version. And I'd like us to talk about that. So to start off with, we're going to watch the captioned version of Brenda Brueggemann's Why I'm Willing.
A commonplace in the deaf community is the never mind moment that ripples through every deaf person's individual experience and our collective consciousness. From family, from friends, from teachers, from co-workers, from the perpetual bombardment of visual media presented to us without captions, we are told, when we hesitantly ask for a repeat of any information that was just verbally delivered, never mind. Well, I do mind. I grew up hard of hearing, my term of choice, although I also didn't hear so well, explained one of my teachers, had a hearing problem, said my grandmother, had moderate to profound hearing loss, precipitously sloping, claimed my audiologist, or more simply put, I had selective hearing, according to my mother. Whatever version, I did not have a deaf identity growing up.
So commentary on their timing, whether or not you paid attention to them as we were watching or if you sort of tuned them out, and how they were overall integrated with the topic of the video itself. Yeah, so it was definitely more formatted or more precise, at least like grammatically speaking, than typical closed captions were. Brenda Brueggemann has what she refers to as her deaf accent. So if you ever have opportunity to read more of her work, she actually talks about this at length. And I think that actually this is a good observation. One of her motivations, in addition to access for including the captions, was to both draw attention to and away from this idea of a deaf accent and what that means for a listening audience. What about the timing of the captions? Slightly ahead. and slightly longer in some cases too, right? Like after she had said something, it kind of lingered. But generally speaking, did it seem to happen enough where you're able to read and listen at the same time? Is that kind of your experience, or were you kind of lagging behind, where you were reading and the sound or the picture shifted?
Well, I felt like there was just like a pattern to the subtitles.
Sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. Generally, it was trying to be timed, but didn't always necessarily succeed in that particular goal. So as we're going to see in a moment, especially with the issue of timing, some of this is the limitations of software that people use, especially because most of the captioning software out there that people tend to use is open source, open access, and isn't necessarily something you pay for. And we're going to practice with this in a couple of minutes here. So what I'd like to do is to show the video unsubtitled, but with a slight twist. What we're going to do, this is the unsubtitled version of her video, but I'm going to turn on YouTube's auto-transcribe feature. Now, is anybody in here familiar with auto-transcribe? I see like some smiles, but I don't know if that's like an actual yes, or you're just guessing. But auto-transcribe, for those who aren't familiar, is YouTube's beta captioning algorithm. So any uncaptioned video that you see on YouTube, you can click the closed caption button down at the bottom, and it'll say CC. It's a little bit hard to see, but it's usually like right there on the video screen. And it will attempt to transcribe based on what YouTube thinks it's hearing. And usually the results are quite hilarious. They're generally pretty awful. And there have actually been a number of parodies of auto-transcribe features where people will sing, say, a Christmas song and have YouTube do its auto-transcribe thing, then they'll re-sing it based on the auto-transcribed lyrics. So there's this whole kind of comedy genre around this particular thing. But I'm going to go ahead and play this, and I'd like you to pay attention to the auto-transcribe feature for a couple of reasons. So one, I want you to see how accurate or inaccurate it is, right? And to try and keep track of some of the more noticeable inaccuracies. But I also want you to think about the larger ramifications this has for access, right? And the responsibility or the irresponsibility of not captioning videos when you post them to YouTube. So again, we'll watch the first 60 seconds and pay attention to what's happening with the captions here when we turn on auto-transcribe.
A commonplace in the deaf community is the never mind moment that ripples through every deaf person's individual experience and our collective consciousness. From family, from friends, from teachers, from co-workers, from the perpetual bombardment of visual media presented to us without captions, we are told, when we hesitantly ask for a repeat of any information that was just verbally delivered, never mind. Well, I do mind. I grew up hard of hearing, my term of choice, although I also didn't hear so well, explained one of my teachers, had a hearing problem, said my grandmother, had moderate to profound hearing loss, precipitously sloping, claimed my audiologist, or more simply put, I had selective hearing, according to my mother. Whatever version, I did not have a deaf identity growing up. In the fall of 1992, at the age of 33, I finally found my way to Gallaudet University, the world's only university for deaf and hard of hearing people. I went to earn what the community called my HBD, or my How to Be Deaf degree. Just a year before I arrived at Gallaudet University, in December 1990, a student there had failed for the fourth time in his efforts to pass the required remedial English class that he needed to take before he could ever even really enter Gallaudet as a full-fledged student.
So I'm going to pause here on a typo, or I guess a caption fail. Instead of Gallaudet, it says Gallagher. So I'd like us to talk a little bit about both what seemed to be working well with the algorithm, but also some really notable noticeable errors in YouTube's attempt to transcribe what Brenda Brueggemann was saying. So could I hear some of the examples that arose that you sort of latched onto? So this is interesting. The timing is actually more precise here than it was on the original, but you gave a really glaring example. So was it deaf people, and instead of deaf people, it said black people in the other transcribe? So the before thing made it more difficult, or it ruined kind of the surprise, maybe, of what was being said. And actually, this is a big problem when you're watching closed captioning on television, is that closed captions often give away surprises. And there's this really, really great article by Sean Zdenek, if you ever have opportunity to look at it. His last name is spelled Zdenek. But he gives all these examples of movies where you're not supposed to know who the bad guy is, but the closed captions say who the bad guy is. So if you were watching by the captions, you'd have no idea, but if you were, it spoils the entire movie, right? So captions as spoilers is really problematic. So it completely erases the context, too, of the conversation, because not only are there distinct typos or misplaced words, right? Like, so my favorite substitution for Gallaudet University was I found God at university. Right, and here we've got Gallagher instead of Gallaudet, so we have no idea that we're even talking about a place or a proper noun kind of place. So just to repeat what was said so that other people can hear it. So what's your name? Sarah. So Sarah indicated surprise that the beginning of the video actually has some pretty complex words, like precipitously sloping. And the captions were off to a surprisingly good and accurate start, and then it quickly broke down and was messing up even simpler words.
Yeah, I was just surprised to see that it was so accurate with her deaf accent, but regardless, I've seen plenty of YouTube videos where that is like the most inaccurate, but not even close to the words that are actually being said and actually
And so this has been an ongoing problem actually with YouTube's beta algorithm. Initially when it was rolled out, if you were to try and test this on videos, it typically would work only with deep male voices, especially deep male voices that were speaking slowly and deliberately. And so I think that YouTube has attempted to try and rectify this, but it's especially awful in terms of how the algorithm works or does not work when it comes to individuals who do not have what might be considered a Midwestern American accent who are speaking very slowly. And you can also think about how badly this will fail, this particular algorithm, if there's any kind of background noise in the recording that might be uploaded. So if we were to take that video recording back there and put it on YouTube, I'm guessing it would be really, really hilariously awful because of the acoustics in the room. So I think we only have a few more minutes, maybe like 10 minutes. Is that about what we have? And I thought it might be interesting to try and take some of the things you just observed and to try and translate them into an actual captioning exercise. So I've got a short video, I believe it's only 18 seconds long. Let's see, I can confirm this. 17 seconds long. And it's a fairly degraded recording, so we'll probably have to jack the volume way up. And even then, you're probably not going to be able to really entirely discern what's being said. But what I'd like us to do, I'm going to play it several times, and I'm going to ask you to attempt to transcribe it. So as you're transcribing, I also want you to try and pay attention to some of the moves and decisions that you're making as you transcribe. So you'll type what you think you hear, and then you'll go back and you'll keep refining it, right, as you hear more accurately or change your mind about things. But what kinds of decisions are you making about pauses, about the emotion in the person's voices, how you're distinguishing between different characters who are speaking? So I'm going to play this. I'd like you to first try and type what you hear, but then after I play it more and more times, I'd like you to go back and refine things and try and make decisions about what you include and how you choose to include it. Make sense? Okay, I'm going to assume it does.
At last, I give you Polly Brown. I'm Miss Polly Brown, the girl you meet at every birthday happy meal. Just try me and see how you feel.
And if it's still struggling to come through in the back, you're welcome to come down here. I think you can hear it
a little bit better underneath this speaker, perhaps.
At last I give you Polly Prune. I'm Miss Polly Prune, the girl you meet at every boarding house meal. Just try me and see how you feel.
One more time, would that be helpful? Or is it getting to the point where you're afraid that this sound loop will never leave your mind? All right, let's do this one more time.
At last I give you Polly Prune. I'm Miss Polly Prune, the girl you meet at every boarding house meal. Just try me and see how you feel.
Okay. So, here's what I'm going to suggest we do. I'd like us to take a few minutes to try and crowdsource a transcript. And I'm imagining that people will, especially for the little girl talking, have really varied responses to what they think they heard. Would anyone volunteer to type up what people are saying up front here? Excellent, okay. So you will be our transcriptionist. You can just come up to the Word document, and what we'll do is we'll tell you what to type. Yes, so this way we can all see it. So what we can perhaps do is start with the little boy. And I'm wondering if somebody can share what they think he was saying. What you had written. Yeah.
At last I give you Polly Prune.
At last I give you Polly Prune. And so let me ask a question about this. When you typed it out, how did you label the boy? So did you put something in the front of that statement? Or did you just sort of leave it as is in terms of what's being said? Like, was there a character name of any kind? Oh, yes.
I didn't give it a character name before Polly Prune. Since he says like Polly Prune, how he sort of like carries it out. So I added like more L's, more Y's, more N's. See if it's a sort of sound out.
Yeah, so lots of like extra O's, L's, U's, N's, because he's saying it in a very drawn out way that you wouldn't surmise otherwise. And did anybody label the speaker of this sentence, or did you just leave it as is? Yeah. We just wrote boy, colon. Did anybody write anything different for those of you who chose to label boy? Was it in all caps, or was it no? So boy, colon. So boy with hat. So let's put boy with hat for now, and then we can come back to whether or not we want to keep boy with hat, if we want to go to boy, or if we want to use an even different title for this particular character in the video. And now let's move on to the little girl talking. Would anybody like to start and offer up what they think they heard the little girl saying? And it's okay at this point if it's just partial. Okay, so everybody has to be able to describe me and see how they feel, I think was what you had just said. Yes. And so maybe what we can do is add a few spaces. Now we're basically guessing, right? So we're going to come back and see which version seems most plausible. And if you can repeat what you had said again.
I'm Miss Polly Prune.
So I'm Miss Polly Prune.
The girl you meet in every morning.
The girl you meet every morning.
And every morning.
Oh, the girl you meet and every morning.
Then there was something I didn't understand.
So dot.
Just try me and see how you feel.
Just try me and see how you feel. All right, so now let's hear some other versions. I'm Miss Polly Prune, the girl you eat every morning at noon. Just try me and see how you feel.
We got I'm Miss Polly Prune, the girl you eat every morning and noon. Everybody just try me and see how you feel.
Is it the same or is there something different?
And instead of at, and then everybody before bed.
Okay, so the girl you eat every morning and noon. Everybody just try me and see how you feel. Yes.
I said, I'm Miss Polly Prune,
Everybody knows me on this.
So I'm Miss Polly Prune, and everybody loves me on this timeshare. And what's the ending saying? Just try me and see how you feel.
No, I just like
You just
got back up.
Okay. Did anybody have anything different than what's up here projected above? So at the end of everything, perhaps in brackets or parentheses and in all caps, laughter. In the interest of time, I think what I'm going to do is replay the video one more time. And I'm just going to keep the video in the back and let the audio track play so that you can stay focused on the Word document up here. But see if any of these items sound like anything resembling what's happening in the video as you listen once more. Thank you so much.
At last, I give you Polly Prune. I'm Miss Polly Prune, the girl you meet at every boarding house meal. Just try me and see how you feel.
One last time.
At last, I give you Polly Prune. I'm Miss Polly Prune, the girl you meet at every boarding house meal. Just try me and see how you feel.
Does any of these seem most plausible to you, having listened to it again and seeing the text sitting up here in front of you? Every morning and noon. So the lines that have every morning and noon. Does anybody have a different interpretation, alternate reading? So we could kind of keep going here, right? But I think that there are a few points that we need to make in terms of this process. So the first being, if the videographer had included captions, your viewing experience would have been much better, right? Because you would have understood what was going on in this particular play. But on top of that, I think this also highlights how highly rhetorical captioning work really is. It's meticulous, and it also requires you to make interpretations, not only about what you're hearing and the accuracy of what people are saying, but even how you determine what sounds to position in the transcript, right? So things like laughter, or if people had been saying things like, like, you know, and other filler words. But even how you describe the characters, right, and choose to delineate who is speaking and when. To sort of save you the suspense, I can tell you what the original actually said. And it's, I'm Miss Polly Prune, the girl that you meet, not eat, the girl you meet at every boarding house meal. Just try me and see how you feel. Right, so that audio was really degraded, but I think also it was particularly hard assignment given what it sounded like the girl might be saying and also the sort of content of the video, right? This is a kindergarten play. Who wrote this script? Those kind of emotions and feelings. So I guess just maybe by way of concluding, and then perhaps we can have questions and discussion. I think that something like accessibility, when we're thinking about design, seems like the kind of task that other people should do, like people are specifically hired for that position. But increasingly, especially because new media is becoming such an important way of how we compose, right? The way we compose is highly digital, highly creative. Accessibility is becoming more and more, I think, the responsibility of everybody, especially if we're talking about a professional kind of writing context. But I also think that there are ways of thinking about it that are particularly enabling, and it also really opens up worlds for who your audience might be. So in terms of the captioning stuff, has anybody ever here, either for work or for pleasure, uploaded a video? Okay, so several people have. So here are some of the benefits of captioning a video. So the first might be increasing access to those who are either non-hearing or people who dwell in noisy environments, right? You can't access the auditory channel of your video as you're captioning. So think about people watching your video in airports or at the gym or on their smartphone as they're sitting on the bus and like their earbuds really suck, right? Like having a caption can really increase access at those moments. You can also think about it though from two other go viral, a caption track increases your chances of doing that. Because now instead of just the title and the tags you put in the video being searchable, the entirety of the video and the transcript is searchable. The last item has to do with international audiences. So especially on YouTube, you can now translate caption tracks. So people who speak different languages, who prefer not to access your video in English, can actually translate it into their language of choice and watch the video that way. So there are phenomenal possibilities with this, and it's actually pretty easy. We could just type this in Word, right, and what we'll do, it's okay, we'll have a wrong translation here. Right, but if I were to save this Word document, I would just go to File and Save As, and you have to save it as a plain text file. There we go, plain text, not a TXT file. You would save your Word document as that file, and then you would just go into YouTube, and you could upload it, and YouTube would type it for you. So it's actually, I mean, it seems like it might be a difficult thing, but it's actually gotten a lot simpler. And just from the perspective of anybody who might be going on the job market, might think of doing multimedia writing or work of some kind, having this as a skill set is a hugely marketable thing. Right? To be able to say that you have worked with accessibility and you know how to do this. So I think that might be my pausing resting point. And I'd love to talk more if people have questions, thoughts, comments. Yeah. Could you walk us through the resources that you have up there? Yes. There are a number of resources that you can use to create more accessible web text. The first item on there belongs to the Center for Universal Design. So we talked about theories of design earlier. This particular website has a number of resources that can help you to create a website. These are more concrete in terms of what they do. So color contrast checker. We probably all have the experience of visiting a website that has a bright red background and bright green Comic Sans text on it. Or maybe not everybody has had that misfortune. Right, but color contrast is an important thing. And unfortunately, a lot of sites on the web don't have adequate contrast between the text and the background. So this particular tool, all you have to do is type in your URL. So whether you've created a blog or a web page or a Tumblr site of some sort, it can tell you whether or not there's sufficient contrast between the text and the background. And the visual here. Has anybody ever used this? Anybody kind of into coding things? So one person, would you mind describing what it does?
So what it does is it checks the HTML for your web page to make sure that if it went through a reader, I don't remember exactly what it's called, but so if you tap through it, it'll tell you like the caption for a picture or like whether or not something's a button. And it just make sure your web becomes accessible.
So to
For a screen reader.
Yeah, screen reader. Yeah, so to repeat what was just said, the W3C validator checks your code and makes sure that it's standards compliant. And it's not a foolproof test. Just because your website passes the validation doesn't mean that it's universally accessible. But it's an excellent starting point. It's really useful for things like screen readers, alt text, captions.
And also, to talk about accessibility, all of the courses that teach these courses I've taken here that teach HTML, all of your websites that you make have to go through the W3C validator before you turn them in.
Yeah, so that's
part of the credit for the project.
Because it's hugely important on a number of levels when we're talking about accessibility in terms of using that validator. So whether you code something by hand or even if you create something on something like WordPress or some kind of proprietary website that creates the site design for you, it not only tells you whether or not it's potentially accessible to a screen reader, but it also does these tests to make sure it's compatible across browsers and platforms. So you don't want to be in the situation where you create a website and nobody who uses Mac can actually access it. You're Calvin, but I'm not really sure what that is. So
believe it's, let me look at what you typed and I can tell you exactly